The Pacific War erupted with a fury that reshaped the tides of global conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had launched Japan into an unprecedented spree of conquests. Within months, their forces stretched from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, each victory tightening their grip on the Pacific. By mid-1942, their hold seemed unshakable, bolstered by the occupation of strategic islands and ports. Yet, beneath the surface of their triumphs lay cracks in their expansionist strategy. Guadalcanal, a relatively obscure island in the Solomon Archipelago, emerged as a focal point in Japan's plans. Here, Japanese engineers and laborers worked tirelessly to construct an airfield, a vital link in securing their southern flank. This airfield, if completed, would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand, severing crucial connections between the Pacific theater and broader Allied operations. For the Allies, allowing this development was unthinkable. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, championed a bold counterstroke. After the Allied victory at Midway, he believed it was time to seize the initiative. Guadalcanal represented more than a strategic point. It was an opportunity to break Japan's seemingly unstoppable momentum. King argued for a swift and decisive operation, a risky but necessary move to prevent the Japanese from fortifying their position in the Solomon Islands. The plan required coordination across multiple nations. Australian and New Zealand forces, vital for local intelligence and logistical support, played a critical role alongside the United States Navy and Marine Corps. Coast Watchers, trained civilians stationed on isolated islands, provided crucial reconnaissance. These efforts underscored the necessity of multinational collaboration in the face of a well-entrenched enemy. However, the path to launching this offensive was fraught with challenges. Logistical preparation faltered under the weight of inadequate resources. Supplies were often loaded haphazardly onto transports, with no system for organized unloading once they arrived. The troops, primarily from the 1st Marine Division, faced grueling training under extreme conditions, simulating amphibious landings in the South Pacific's sweltering heat. Many of these men had never seen combat, let alone participated in an operation of such magnitude. Despite these difficulties, the Allies forged ahead. Guadalcanal became the chosen battlefield, where they would stake their claim to the Pacific. The operation, codenamed Watchtower, would mark the first large-scale Allied amphibious assault of the war. What lay ahead was not merely a clash over territory, but the beginning of a campaign that would redefine the dynamics of the Pacific War. The gamble was immense, the stakes even higher. For those who stepped ashore, Guadalcanal would become not just a place but a crucible, testing the mettle of men and the resolve of nations. By July 1942, Allied planners had finalized Operation Watchtower, the code name for the assault on Guadalcanal and its neighboring islands. The stakes were monumental. If successful, the Allies would disrupt Japan's southern expansion and establish a foothold for future offensives. The planning was meticulous but rushed, reflecting the urgency to act before Japan solidified its defenses on the island. Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and the nearby islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo were selected as initial targets. Tulagi, already hosting a Japanese seaplane base, posed a significant threat to Allied shipping routes. Guadalcanal itself offered a strategic prize, the airfield under construction at Lunga Point. With its completion, Japan could extend its aerial dominance over the South Pacific, putting Australia and Allied supply lines in jeopardy. On August 7, 1942, under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, the Allied invasion fleet, consisting of over 75 ships, approached its objectives. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious task force, while Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher provided air support with 3 aircraft carriers: USS Saratoga, USS Wasp, and USS Enterprise. The fleet represented the full might of the Allied naval forces in the South Pacific, but it also bore the weight of high expectations and untested coordination. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, the invasion began. Naval bombardments preceded the landings, with heavy shells raining down on enemy positions. The deafening roar of the guns shook the islands, signaling the arrival of Allied forces. Japanese defenders on Tulagi and nearby islets scrambled to respond, but their defenses were no match for the overwhelming firepower. The Marines of the 1st Marine Division, led by Major General Alexander Vandegrift, were tasked with the landings. Despite intense training, this marked the first amphibious operation for most of them. The terrain and lack of experience posed significant challenges. Small landing craft, known as Higgins boats, ferried troops ashore, but the strong currents and narrow beaches complicated the process. Orders to offload supplies in an orderly fashion quickly dissolved into chaos as logistical issues surfaced. On Guadalcanal, the landings were met with minimal resistance. Japanese forces, caught off guard, had abandoned their positions near Lunga Point and retreated into the dense jungle. The Marines quickly secured the beachhead and began their push inland. By the end of the first day, they reached the airfield, which was still incomplete but would later be renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. Meanwhile, the landings on Tulagi unfolded under entirely different circumstances. Japanese defenders, entrenched in well-camouflaged positions, resisted fiercely. The Marines encountered machine gun fire, booby traps, and snipers as they advanced. Naval support proved crucial, with destroyers providing cover fire against entrenched positions. By the end of the day, significant progress was made, but the fighting was far from over. Air support from Admiral Fletcher's carriers played a pivotal role in the success of the initial landings. F-4F Wildcats patrolled the skies, ensuring that Japanese bombers from Rabaul could not disrupt the operations. Despite the heavy use of carrier-based aircraft, Fletcher faced the daunting decision of whether to keep his carriers close to the battle zone or retreat to safer waters. His caution, stemming from the loss of carriers at Coral Sea and Midway, would soon lead to contentious debates among Allied commanders. The challenges of amphibious warfare became apparent almost immediately. Supplies piled up chaotically on the beaches, far from the inland positions where they were needed. Many Marines found themselves short on ammunition, food, and medical supplies, forcing them to rely on hastily organized resupply missions. The lack of proper landing craft further exacerbated the situation, as troops struggled to navigate the narrow channels and shifting tides. Despite these challenges, the first day of Operation Watchtower was marked by significant successes. Guadalcanal's airfield was firmly under Allied control, and the foothold on Tulagi signaled the beginning of a larger campaign to secure the Solomon Islands. The landings demonstrated the potential of coordinated air, land, and sea operations, but they also highlighted the steep learning curve the Allies faced in amphibious warfare. As night fell on August 7th, the Marines prepared for the inevitable counterattacks. The dense jungle, unfamiliar terrain, and looming presence of Japanese forces created an atmosphere of tension. Yet, the day's achievements marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The Allies had taken their first step in reversing Japan's seemingly unstoppable advance, setting the stage for a prolonged and brutal campaign. The landings at Guadalcanal unfolded with unexpected ease, but the same could not be said for the nearby islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. These smaller outposts, located just across Ironbottom Sound, were far more fortified and strategically significant than their size suggested. Home to Japanese naval personnel and seaplane bases, they posed a considerable threat to Allied operations and demanded immediate neutralization. On August 7th, as the Marines began to secure Guadalcanal's beaches, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, landed on Tulagi. The Marines were met with stiff resistance from entrenched Japanese forces. Unlike the retreating defenders on Guadalcanal, the Japanese on Tulagi had prepared their positions with meticulous precision. Machine guns, bunkers, and snipers made every step a deadly challenge. The raiders advanced cautiously through dense jungle and rocky terrain, clearing one defensive position after another. Japanese snipers, concealed in treetops or among the ruins of old colonial buildings, inflicted steady casualties. These hidden marksmen would wait until Marine units had passed, then fire from behind, causing chaos and slowing progress. The Marines responded with disciplined tactics, using grenades and coordinated fire to eliminate threats, but the toll was significant. Meanwhile, on Gavutu and Tanambogo, the fighting escalated into one of the most brutal clashes of the early campaign. These two small islands, connected by a narrow causeway, hosted the Japanese seaplane base. The initial waves of Marines landing on Gavutu faced a storm of rifle and machine gun fire. The steep, rocky hills provided the Japanese defenders with a natural fortress, and the Marines struggled to gain a foothold. The situation worsened as the second wave approached. Japanese defenders had regrouped and concentrated their fire on the landing craft, causing heavy casualties even before the Marines reached the shore. One of the first tanks to disembark was destroyed almost immediately, as Japanese soldiers jammed crowbars into its treads and set it alight with gasoline-soaked rags. Despite these setbacks, the Marines pressed forward, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat to clear the island. By nightfall, Gavutu was under Marine control, but Tanambogo remained a deadly stronghold. Reinforcements were called in to secure the second island. The narrow causeway connecting the two islands became a deadly gauntlet, as Japanese machine guns raked any attempt to cross. The Marines, bolstered by fresh troops, launched a coordinated assault under the cover of naval bombardment. The fighting was savage, with grenades and flamethrowers used to clear Japanese bunkers. The enemy's staunch resistance and refusal to surrender foreshadowed the intense combat that would characterize the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The psychological impact of these battles on the Marines was profound. For many, this was their first encounter with the fanatical resolve of Japanese soldiers. Reports of defenders committing suicide rather than surrendering shocked the Marines. In one case, Japanese officers shot their comrades and themselves rather than face capture. Instances of feigned surrenders, followed by sudden attacks, quickly taught the Marines to adopt a no-prisoners approach. The carnage of Gavutu and Tanambogo did not end with the final gunshots. The aftermath revealed the full cost of the fighting. Dozens of Marines lay dead, and nearly half of the Japanese garrison on Gavutu was killed before the rest retreated to Tanambogo. The Marines faced grueling work to root out the remaining defenders, often finding them entrenched in caves or camouflage positions. Explosives were used to seal off these strongpoints, a grim but necessary tactic to ensure the islands were secure. On Tulagi, the battle raged for 2 days. The Marines encountered a labyrinth of defensive positions that required methodical clearing. The Japanese defenders fought to the last man, their discipline and tactical proficiency forcing the Marines to adapt quickly. The raiders' use of coordinated fire teams and demolitions ultimately proved decisive, but not before enduring heavy casualties. By August 9th, the islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo were firmly in Allied hands. The cost had been high, with over 400 Japanese defenders killed and significant Marine losses. These victories, however, were strategically critical. The elimination of the Japanese seaplane base removed a major threat to Allied naval and air operations in the area. The psychological toll on both sides was immense, marking the beginning of a new and grueling phase in the Pacific War. The battles for these small islands underscored the determination of both sides. For the Marines, the experience was a baptism of fire that forged resilience and adaptability. For the Japanese, their fierce resistance reflected a broader strategy of defending every inch of territory with unyielding resolve. These lessons would echo throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, setting the tone for the brutal and protracted struggle ahead. As the initial battles for Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and the surrounding islets unfolded, a new phase of the campaign began to take shape in the skies and through the efforts of Allied intelligence networks. This stage, dominated by the duel for air supremacy and the critical role of reconnaissance, would set the tone for the broader campaign. One of the Allies' most effective tools during this time was a network of coast watchers stationed on remote islands across the Pacific. These individuals, primarily Australian civilians and military personnel, had an intimate knowledge of the terrain and were equipped with radios to report Japanese movements. Coast watchers like Paul Mason on Bougainville and Jack Red near Buka Passage provided invaluable warnings about incoming enemy aircraft and ships. Their timely transmissions allowed the Allied forces to prepare for incoming attacks and adjust their strategies accordingly. Their role, though often overlooked, became a linchpin of the campaign's early successes. While the ground troops secured their positions, the skies above Guadalcanal became a theater of relentless combat. The airfield on Guadalcanal, soon to be operational as Henderson Field, was a prize that both sides recognized as critical. Until it could be fully utilized, air cover for the Marines depended entirely on carrier-based aircraft. Admiral Fletcher's fleet of Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp patrolled the skies, engaging Japanese aircraft attempting to disrupt Allied operations. The Japanese, operating from their stronghold in Rabaul, sent waves of bombers escorted by the formidable Zero fighters. The Mitsubishi A6M0, with its unmatched maneuverability and range, presented a significant challenge to the F-4F Wildcat, the primary fighter of the U.S. Navy. The Wildcats, though slower and less agile, were sturdier and could absorb more damage. Pilots quickly learned to avoid dogfighting the Zeros directly, instead employing tactics like the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver designed to trap enemy planes in overlapping fields of fire. The first major air clashes highlighted the brutal realities of aerial warfare in the Pacific. On August 8th, just a day after the landings, Japanese bombers launched a concentrated attack on the invasion fleet. Coast watchers had provided early warnings, allowing Fletcher's Wildcats to intercept the incoming planes. The skies over Guadalcanal were soon filled with tracer fire and twisting dogfights. The Wildcats managed to down several bombers, but not without cost. Japanese fighters retaliated with precision, taking down several American planes. The attacks on the fleet underscored the vulnerability of Allied forces without a fully operational airfield. Fletcher, already wary of risking his carriers, withdrew his task force farther from Guadalcanal, leaving the Marines with limited air cover. This decision, while arguably prudent, sparked criticism among Allied commanders and further strained relationships between the Navy and the ground forces. General Vandegrift, tasked with holding the beachhead, now faced the prospect of defending his positions with minimal air and naval support. Amid these challenges, the intelligence efforts of the Allies proved critical. Intercepted Japanese communications, decoded by Allied cryptographers, provided insights into enemy strategies. The work of Station Hypo in Hawaii, which had played a crucial role in the victory at Midway, continued to yield valuable information. Reports indicated that the Japanese were mobilizing reinforcements and preparing counterattacks to retake Guadalcanal. This intelligence gave the Allies a much-needed edge in anticipating Japanese moves. Despite the initial dominance of Japanese aircraft, cracks began to appear in their strategy. The long distances from Rabaul to Guadalcanal stretched their logistical capabilities. Pilots, flying nearly 600 miles one way, arrived exhausted and with limited fuel for combat engagements. This logistical strain meant that even when Japanese aircraft achieved tactical successes, they often struggled to capitalize on them. For American pilots, these early battles became a proving ground. Names like Joe Foss, who would later become one of the Marine Corps' most celebrated aces, began to emerge as symbols of resilience and skill. Foss, flying from Henderson Field once it became operational, exemplified the determination of the American forces. His ability to adapt to the Zero's strengths and weaknesses became a blueprint for other pilots. The Japanese, for their part, were not without their own aces and strategic thinkers. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most renowned pilots, participated in these early clashes. His skill and experience made him a formidable opponent, and his accounts of the air battles provide a sobering perspective on the intensity of the combat. By mid-August, the air campaign had begun to stabilize. Henderson Field, though still vulnerable, started receiving aircraft from the Cactus Air Force, a mix of Marine, Navy, and Army planes. This addition marked a turning point, as it allowed the Allies to establish a permanent presence in the skies above Guadalcanal. The battles were far from over, but the ability to project air power from land gave the Allies a critical advantage. The interplay between intelligence, air power, and ground operations during this phase highlighted the interconnected nature of modern warfare. Success on one front often depended on contributions from another. Coast watchers, cryptographers, and pilots all played their part in ensuring that the tenuous foothold on Guadalcanal remained intact. The lessons learned during these early weeks would shape the strategies and tactics of both sides as the campaign intensified. For the Allies, the struggle for control of the skies was not just about survival. It was about setting the stage for a broader offensive. Each victory, however small, brought them closer to securing the island and disrupting Japan's plans. For the Japanese, the realization that their air superiority could be contested marked a shift in the dynamics of the Pacific War. The battle for Guadalcanal had become a test of endurance, strategy, and willpower, one that neither side could afford to lose. As the landings on Guadalcanal progressed and the Marines dug in around Henderson Field, the naval forces supporting the invasion faced an impending disaster. The Japanese, determined to retaliate and disrupt the Allied foothold, launched a night attack that would become one of the most devastating defeats in American naval history. This was the Battle of Savo Island. Admiral Genichi Mikawa, commanding the Japanese 8th Fleet, devised a bold plan. He aimed to strike under the cover of darkness, exploiting the Allies' lack of experience in night operations. His force included 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer. Mikawa's ships had assembled at Rabaul and steamed south through the infamous Slot, a narrow waterway offering a direct approach to Guadalcanal. Their mission: to destroy the Allied naval forces protecting the beachhead. The Allies, meanwhile, suffered from a series of critical oversights. Despite multiple warnings from coast watchers and reconnaissance planes about a Japanese task force heading south, the reports were downplayed or dismissed by commanders. Allied forces lacked cohesive coordination, and their ships were spread across multiple sectors around Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The most glaring vulnerability was the lack of aerial reconnaissance in the Slot, a blind spot that Mikawa exploited with devastating efficiency. On the night of August 8, 1942, Mikawa's task force approached undetected. Allied ships in the area, including Australian and American cruisers, were unaware of the looming danger. Exhausted after days of continuous operations, many crews were unprepared for a nocturnal battle. Compounding the problem, the Allied fleet had no coordinated radar coverage, while the Japanese excelled at night fighting, employing techniques honed in earlier campaigns. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Mikawa's cruisers launched their attack. The Japanese force swept into the area between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, catching the Allied ships completely off guard. Using searchlights and star shells to illuminate their targets, the Japanese unleashed a barrage of torpedoes and gunfire. The results were catastrophic. The heavy cruisers USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and USS Astoria, along with the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra, were pummeled in rapid succession. Torpedoes struck with devastating accuracy, igniting fuel stores and ammunition. Fires erupted across the decks, and the dark waters of Ironbottom Sound were soon littered with burning debris and struggling sailors. The Japanese gunners displayed remarkable precision, while the Allied crews, caught in confusion, struggled to mount an effective counterattack. One of the most harrowing moments came aboard the USS Quincy, which attempted to return fire as it was struck by multiple torpedoes. Despite the chaos, her gunners managed to damage the Japanese cruiser Chokai, but the Quincy was doomed. Flames engulfed the ship, and it sank within minutes, taking hundreds of sailors with her. The HMAS Canberra, struck early in the battle, was left crippled and burning. Australian sailors fought valiantly to save their ship, but she was eventually scuttled to prevent her capture. The surviving American cruisers, badly damaged, limped away from the battlefield. Mikawa's force inflicted these losses with minimal damage to their own ships. By dawn, they had withdrawn, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The Allies had lost 4 heavy cruisers and nearly 1,000 sailors in a single night. It was one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the U.S. Navy and underscored the dire consequences of underestimating the Japanese Navy's capabilities. The impact of the battle was immediate and profound. The destruction of Allied naval forces left the Marines on Guadalcanal without sufficient naval support or resupply. The remaining ships, wary of further attacks, withdrew to safer waters. This effectively handed the Japanese temporary control of the sea lanes around Guadalcanal, complicating the Allies' efforts to consolidate their position. The battle also exposed significant flaws in Allied command and coordination. Communication breakdowns, insufficient reconnaissance, and an over-reliance on daytime tactics highlighted the need for better preparation and adaptability. Criticism quickly mounted, and questions arose about the decisions made by Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, whose carrier group had already retreated after the initial landings. Despite the heavy losses, lessons were learned. The Allies began to recognize the importance of night fighting and radar technology, areas where they lagged far behind the Japanese. In the wake of Savo Island, American naval strategists worked to improve their fleet's night combat capabilities, a shift that would prove crucial in later battles. For the Japanese, the victory at Savo Island reinforced their belief in the effectiveness of aggressive night operations. However, Mikawa's decision to withdraw without targeting the vulnerable Allied transports, still unloading supplies on Guadalcanal, would be scrutinized in hindsight. While his caution spared his ships from potential daylight air attacks, it allowed the Marines to maintain their foothold, a missed opportunity that would haunt Japanese commanders as the campaign dragged on. The Battle of Savo Island marked a grim chapter in the Guadalcanal campaign. It was a stark reminder of the challenges the Allies faced in the Pacific, where the balance of power often shifted with the tide. The losses were devastating, but the resolve of the Allied forces remained unbroken. The campaign for Guadalcanal was far from over, and the sacrifices of those who fought at Savo Island would not be in vain. The lessons learned in that dark night would shape the course of the Pacific War, driving the Allies to adapt, innovate, and ultimately prevail. As the fiery remains of Allied ships settled into the depths of Ironbottom Sound, following the Battle of Savo Island, the Marines on Guadalcanal faced a daunting reality. The Japanese, though momentarily pushed back, were far from defeated. Their efforts to reclaim the strategic island escalated into a grueling struggle marked by relentless attacks, resource shortages, and psychological strain. For the Marines defending Henderson Field, every day was a battle for survival. General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, understood the precariousness of his position. The initial success in capturing the incomplete Japanese airfield, quickly renamed Henderson Field, had provided a foothold. However, the loss of naval support after Savo Island left the Marines isolated, with limited resupply capabilities. Recognizing the need to solidify their defenses, Vandegrift ordered the construction of extensive fortifications around Henderson Field. Using whatever materials they could find, logs, sandbags, and even debris from the Japanese construction sites, the Marines worked tirelessly to create strong points, trenches, and barriers. Henderson Field became the heart of the Marine defense. Controlling the airstrip was vital for maintaining aerial superiority and receiving supplies. The airfield's location on a grassy plain near the island's northern coast allowed for strategic oversight of surrounding areas, but it was also vulnerable to enemy fire and infiltration. Japanese artillery from positions along the Tenor River and the jungle-clad ridges to the south posed a constant threat. The Japanese, determined to recapture Guadalcanal, launched a series of aggressive attacks. In late August 1942, The Battle of the Tenere demonstrated the ferocity of their efforts. Japanese forces, led by Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki, attempted a frontal assault on the marine perimeter east of Henderson Field. Overconfident in their ability to overwhelm the Americans, Ichiki's troops launched a nighttime bayonet charge against heavily fortified positions. The Marines, equipped with machine guns and mortars, inflicted devastating losses. By dawn, Ichiki's battalion had been nearly annihilated, leaving hundreds of bodies scattered across the battlefield. Despite their victory, the Marines were haunted by the suicidal determination of their enemies. The Japanese did not relent. Reinforcements arrived via the so-called Tokyo Express, a series of high-speed supply runs conducted by destroyers through the slot. These night operations allowed the Japanese to bring in troops, ammunition, and supplies while avoiding American air and naval patrols. Each new wave of Japanese soldiers intensified the pressure on the Marines. As the weeks dragged on, the Marines faced their own logistical nightmare. Cut off from reliable naval support, they relied heavily on airdrop supplies from Allied aircraft based on Espiritu Santo and other nearby islands. Rations were strictly controlled, with troops subsisting on meager portions of canned goods, rice, and hardtack. Medical supplies were scarce, and diseases such as malaria and dysentery spread rapidly through the ranks. By early September, nearly every Marine suffered from some form of illness or malnutrition. Psychological strain took its toll as well. The relentless jungle environment, with its oppressive humidity and constant threat of ambush, wore down even the most hardened soldiers. Japanese snipers, concealed in the dense foliage or perched in trees, inflicted steady casualties. At night, the Marines endured harassing fire and probing attacks aimed at testing their defenses. Sleep was a rare luxury, and morale ebbed as exhaustion mounted. Amid these challenges, the significance of Guadalcanal became increasingly apparent. Henderson Field was not just a tactical prize. It represented a strategic turning point in the Pacific War. Control of the airstrip allowed the Allies to project power across the Solomon Islands and prevent Japanese expansion toward Australia. For the Japanese, its recapture was critical to maintaining their defensive perimeter and securing supply routes. The Marines' resilience in the face of overwhelming odds earned them the nickname, the Cactus Air Force, a nod to the code name for the Guadalcanal campaign. Their determination inspired reinforcements and rallied support from the American public. Pilots from Henderson Field, flying F-4F Wildcats and SPD Dauntless dive bombers, conducted daring sorties against Japanese shipping and positions, earning a reputation for audacity and effectiveness. Despite their successes, the Marines knew that the struggle for Guadalcanal was far from over. Each Japanese attack revealed the enemy's capacity for adaptation and persistence. As the weeks turned into months, both sides prepared for an even greater clash, one that would determine the fate of the Pacific. For now, the Marines clung to their tenuous hold on Henderson Field, knowing that their sacrifices were laying the foundation for eventual victory. As the battle for Guadalcanal wore on, it became clear that control of the skies over the Solomon Islands would decide the campaign's outcome. Henderson Field, the lifeline of the Allied forces on Guadalcanal, was not only a tactical stronghold, but a symbol of resistance against the Japanese advance. Maintaining operational dominance in the air was a constant struggle, punctuated by innovative tactics, harrowing dogfights, and evolving strategies on both sides. The skies above Guadalcanal became a theater of ceaseless combat. The American Cactus Air Force, named for the campaign's code name, Operation Cactus, was composed of Marine, Navy, and Army Air Corps squadrons. Operating from Henderson Field, their mission was straightforward yet monumental: defend the airstrip, support ground forces, and disrupt Japanese supply lines. Flying a mix of F-4F Wildcats, SPD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, these pilots often faced overwhelming odds against a better-trained and more experienced enemy. The Japanese, determined to neutralize the threat posed by Henderson Field, conducted regular air raids using their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, G4M Betty bombers, and the occasional reinforcement from their carriers. The Zero, renowned for its agility and range, initially outclassed the Wildcats in air-to-air combat. American pilots, however, quickly adapted, employing new tactics to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. They avoided tight turns that favored the Zero's maneuverability, and instead relied on high-speed dives and team-based engagements. Key figures emerged during this phase of the campaign. Among them was Major John L. Smith, who led his Marine Fighting Squadron 223 with distinction, earning the Medal of Honor for his exemplary leadership and aerial prowess. His squadron claimed numerous victories, becoming a symbol of hope for the beleaguered forces on the ground. Equally significant were the stories of Japanese aces who displayed remarkable skill and determination, often flying missions under increasingly challenging conditions as Allied pilots became more adept at countering their tactics. Henderson Field itself was a target of relentless Japanese bombing raids. The airstrip's maintenance crews worked around the clock to repair craters and restore damaged facilities. Makeshift repairs were often completed under the cover of darkness, as daylight brought the near certainty of renewed attacks. The Cactus Air Force's planes, frequently patched up with scavenged parts, launched sorties to intercept Japanese bombers or attack enemy ships in the slot. These missions were as daring as they were essential, disrupting Japanese resupply efforts and forcing the enemy to divert resources to defend their convoys. The most notable engagements in the air included repeated battles over the slot, the narrow channel between Guadalcanal and nearby islands. This area became a deadly gauntlet for both sides, with American pilots targeting the Tokyo Express, the Japanese resupply convoys. These high-stakes missions required exceptional bravery, as the pilots faced not only enemy aircraft but also anti-aircraft fire from Japanese ships. Despite heavy losses, the Cactus Air Force's efforts significantly hampered the flow of reinforcements to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. The Japanese also suffered setbacks due to logistical challenges and strategic miscalculations. The long distances their planes had to travel from bases in Rabaul and Bougainville left them with limited fuel for combat. Additionally, the attrition of experienced pilots, many of whom had honed their skills in the early months of the war, began to take a toll. Unlike the Americans, whose pilot training programs were ramping up to meet wartime demand, the Japanese struggled to replace their losses with similarly skilled aviators. One turning point in the aerial campaign was the American raid on the Japanese base at Bin, on Bougainville Island. Conducted with precision and daring, this strike disrupted Japanese operations and demonstrated the growing effectiveness of Allied air power in the region. Such raids forced the Japanese to divert resources to protect their rear areas, easing the pressure on Henderson Field and the Marines fighting on Guadalcanal. The air battles over Guadalcanal were not confined to daytime engagements. Night missions, a relatively new aspect of aerial warfare, added another layer of complexity to the campaign. The use of radar-equipped planes and improved navigation techniques allowed American forces to intercept Japanese bombers under the cover of darkness. These nocturnal clashes, while less frequent than daytime dogfights, showcased the increasing sophistication of Allied tactics. The relentless fighting took a toll on both sides. For the Americans, the strain of maintaining constant vigilance over Henderson Field led to fatigue and high attrition rates among pilots. For the Japanese, the loss of seasoned aviators and the mounting difficulty of resupplying their forces created a growing sense of desperation. Despite these challenges, the morale of the Cactus Air Force remained remarkably high. Their efforts were bolstered by the knowledge that their actions were pivotal to the survival of the Marines on Guadalcanal. Each successful mission, whether it was the downing of a Japanese bomber or the destruction of an enemy convoy, brought a tangible sense of achievement. For the pilots, many of whom were barely out of flight school, Guadalcanal was both a crucible of combat and a proving ground for their skills. By late 1942, the tide of the air war began to shift decisively in favor of the Allies. The cumulative effects of American persistence improved tactics, and the growing disparity in resources between the two sides became apparent. The skies over Guadalcanal, once contested with near-equal ferocity, were increasingly dominated by American planes. This control allowed for more effective support of ground operations and set the stage for the next phase of the campaign. The air war over Guadalcanal was a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the Allied forces. It highlighted the critical importance of air power in modern warfare and underscored the interconnected nature of the campaign. For the men who fought in the skies, their sacrifices ensured that the battle for Guadalcanal would ultimately favor the Allies, marking a crucial turning point in the Pacific War. The battle for Guadalcanal was not fought solely on land or in the skies. It was equally contested in the waters of the Solomon Islands. The critical issue for both sides was logistics. For the Americans, holding Henderson Field depended on keeping their supply lines open across the Pacific. For the Japanese, reinforcing their troops on Guadalcanal required swift and secure naval routes. What followed was a war of convoys, night battles, and strategic ingenuity, with the waters of the slot serving as a deadly battleground. The Japanese resupply effort, infamously dubbed the Tokyo Express by Allied forces, became a lifeline for their beleaguered forces on Guadalcanal. Utilizing destroyers and smaller, fast-moving vessels, the Tokyo Express ferried men, ammunition, and provisions under the cover of darkness. These operations were necessary because slower, heavily laden transport ships were highly vulnerable to air attacks from Henderson Field. Japanese destroyers, designed for speed and armed with formidable torpedoes, could evade Allied patrols and deliver critical supplies directly to Guadalcanal's beaches. However, this strategy came with significant trade-offs. Destroyers, typically optimized for combat rather than cargo, could only carry a fraction of the supplies needed by Japanese forces. Moreover, their frequent use in resupply missions stretched the Imperial Navy's resources thin, limiting their availability for other operations. Despite these challenges, the Tokyo Express continued to operate, posing a persistent threat to Allied control in the region. The Americans, under the leadership of Vice Admiral William Halsey, sought to disrupt these resupply missions with aggressive naval actions. Halsey, known for his decisive and bold approach, was instrumental in revitalizing Allied morale during the Guadalcanal campaign. With limited resources at his disposal, he relied on a mix of cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft from Henderson Field to intercept Japanese convoys. These missions, often conducted at night, turned the slot into a perilous arena of naval combat. One of the defining features of this naval war was the development of innovative tactics on both sides. Japanese destroyers relied on their powerful long lance torpedoes, capable of traveling long distances with devastating accuracy. These torpedoes often caught Allied ships by surprise, inflicting heavy losses in night battles. Meanwhile, American commanders adapted by employing radar-equipped ships to gain an edge in the darkness. The use of radar gave Allied forces the ability to detect and engage enemy vessels before they were spotted visually, a significant technological advantage. The night battles in the slot were marked by chaos and ferocity. One of the most notable encounters was the Battle of Cape Esperance, fought in October 1942. Under the command of Rear Admiral Norman Scott, an American task force intercepted a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Guadalcanal. The battle was a tactical victory for the Allies, as they managed to sink several Japanese ships while sustaining relatively minor losses. This engagement showcased the growing effectiveness of Allied night fighting techniques and provided a much-needed boost to morale. Despite these successes, the naval war was far from one-sided. The Japanese demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, scoring significant victories that threatened to tip the balance. One such engagement was the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, a multi-day conflict involving both surface ships and aircraft. During this battle, the Japanese inflicted heavy losses on the Allies, sinking several cruisers and destroyers. However, The Americans managed to hold their ground, preventing the Japanese from landing critical reinforcements. The constant naval clashes took a heavy toll on both sides. For the Japanese, the relentless attrition of ships and experienced sailors became increasingly unsustainable. The loss of key vessels, such as the battleship Hai during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, highlighted the growing vulnerability of their fleet. On the Allied side, the challenge of maintaining supply lines across vast distances was compounded by the need to replace damaged and destroyed ships. The introduction of new commanders, such as Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan and Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, brought fresh perspectives and renewed determination to the campaign. Beyond the battles themselves, the naval war had profound implications for the broader campaign. The disruption of Japanese supply lines by the Allies directly impacted the fighting on Guadalcanal, where Japanese troops faced shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Malnutrition and disease became rampant among Japanese forces, weakening their ability to mount effective offensives. Conversely, the ability of the Allies to sustain their forces on Guadalcanal, despite significant losses at sea, underscored the strategic importance of their naval operations. The war at sea also highlighted the critical role of air power in modern naval warfare. Aircraft from Henderson Field played a pivotal role in identifying and attacking Japanese convoys, often forcing them to unload supplies hastily or abandon their missions altogether. Conversely, Japanese land-based and carrier aircraft launched numerous strikes against Allied shipping, inflicting considerable damage. The interplay between air and naval forces created a dynamic and constantly evolving battlefield, where success often depended on the ability to anticipate and counter the enemy's moves. The leadership of figures like Halsey, Scott, and Lee proved instrumental in navigating these challenges. Their willingness to take risks and adapt to the changing nature of the campaign reflected the resilience and ingenuity of the Allied forces. Halsey, in particular, became a symbol of determination, inspiring his men to persevere despite the odds. By the end of 1942, the naval war around Guadalcanal had reached a turning point. The cumulative impact of Allied operations had crippled the Japanese resupply effort, leaving their forces on the island increasingly isolated. The Tokyo Express, once a symbol of Japanese resolve, became a desperate and unsustainable endeavor. Meanwhile, the Allies, bolstered by reinforcements and new equipment, gained greater control over the waters of the Solomon Islands. The naval war for Guadalcanal was a testament to the strategic importance of logistics in modern warfare. It demonstrated that victory on the battlefield often depended on the ability to sustain and supply one's forces, even in the face of relentless opposition. For the men who fought in these waters, their courage and ingenuity ensured that the tide of the Pacific War continued to turn in favor of the Allies. The Guadalcanal campaign reached its zenith in October 1942, as both the Allies and Japanese forces recognized the island's pivotal role in the Pacific theater. With neither side willing to concede defeat, the battles during this period were characterized by an unparalleled intensity. This phase of the campaign was marked by the Japanese attempt to reclaim Henderson Field, a critical airstrip that symbolized control over the skies and seas around Guadalcanal. As October began, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters devised a bold plan to launch a decisive counteroffensive. Reinforcements and supplies were funneled through the Tokyo Express despite the increasing risks posed by Allied naval and air operations. Commanders like Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake sought to overwhelm American positions with a combination of coordinated land assaults and naval bombardments. The stakes were high. A successful Japanese assault would allow them to reclaim Henderson Field, restore their logistical lifeline, and reassert dominance in the Solomon Islands. The Allies, however, were not idle. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, continued to fortify positions around Henderson Field. Despite limited resources and the constant threat of Japanese attacks, Vandegrift maintained a tight grip on his troops' morale and discipline. The Marines, reinforced by elements of the Army's Americall Division, understood the strategic importance of the airfield. It wasn't just about the ground they held. It was about holding the line for future Pacific offensives. The climax came in mid-October with the Japanese assault on Henderson Field. The attack, often referred to as the Battle for Henderson Field, was a massive operation involving more than 20,000 Japanese troops. Preceded by intense naval bombardments, the assault was launched under the cover of night, leveraging the Japanese expertise in night combat. The primary objective was to breach American defenses and neutralize the airfield. On the ground, the Marines and soldiers dug in, bracing for what many described as the most grueling combat of the campaign. Machine gun nests, mortar teams, and hastily constructed trenches formed the backbone of their defense. Japanese troops, known for their ferocity and willingness to fight to the death, launched wave after wave of attacks. In one of the most critical moments, the Japanese nearly broke through the American lines at the Matanacaw River. However, through a combination of artillery support, close air support from Henderson Field, and the sheer tenacity of the defenders, the lines held. The cost for the Japanese was catastrophic. Thousands of soldiers were killed in futile assaults, their bodies piling up along the defensive lines. The failure to capture Henderson Field dealt a severe blow to Japanese morale. It also exposed the growing logistical and operational weaknesses of their forces. The lack of sufficient food, ammunition, and medical supplies left their troops in a dire state. Many Japanese soldiers succumbed not to enemy bullets, but to starvation and disease, a tragic testament to the difficulties of sustaining operations in such a remote and hostile environment. At sea, the Japanese Navy sought to provide support for the offensive with a massive bombardment campaign. The arrival of battleships like the Congo and Haruna was meant to obliterate Allied positions on Guadalcanal. Yet, despite inflicting some damage, these naval operations failed to achieve their intended impact. The Allies, benefiting from radar technology and air reconnaissance, were able to disrupt Japanese naval movements. Aircraft from Henderson Field attacked supply convoys and warships, forcing the Japanese to divert resources to protect their fleet. The turning point solidified with the Allies' growing dominance in the skies. The relentless air raids from Henderson Field ensured that Japanese reinforcements and supplies were increasingly difficult to land. Pilots flying F-4F Wildcats and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers became heroes in their own right, taking the fight to Japanese positions across the Solomon Islands. The destruction of Japanese supply ships and the crippling of their naval forces underscored the effectiveness of Allied air power. The lessons learned by both sides during this phase of the campaign were profound. For the Japanese, the overestimation of their troops' endurance and the underestimation of American resolve proved fatal. Commanders like Hyakutake were criticized for their rigid adherence to plans that failed to account for the realities of the battlefield. For the Allies, the victory highlighted the importance of coordination between ground, naval, and air forces. Figures like Vandegrift and Admiral William Halsey demonstrated the value of adaptive leadership in the face of uncertainty. As October drew to a close, the Japanese began to reconsider their position on Guadalcanal. The failure of their counteroffensive marked a significant shift in the campaign's momentum. What had started as a fierce contest for control of the island now leaned heavily in favor of the Allies. The decision to begin withdrawing troops, though not officially announced, became inevitable as the realities of the situation set in. For the Allies, the victory at Henderson Field was more than just a tactical success. It was a symbol of their growing ability to match and surpass Japanese military prowess. The lessons learned during this phase of the Guadalcanal campaign would shape the conduct of future operations in the Pacific. It was a testament to the resilience of the men who fought there, enduring unimaginable hardships to secure a foothold in the war against Japan. The battle for Henderson Field was a turning point not just for Guadalcanal, but for the entire Pacific theater. It marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion and the emergence of Allied momentum that would carry them through to ultimate victory. For the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who fought there, it was a moment of profound sacrifice and enduring legacy. The battle for Guadalcanal, which began as a daring gamble by the Allies, concluded with profound implications for the Pacific theater. By February 1943, Japanese forces had withdrawn from the island, leaving behind a shattered dream of dominance in the South Pacific. For the Allies, Guadalcanal became a symbol of their growing strength and determination, while for Japan, it marked the beginning of an irreversible decline. Strategically, the Guadalcanal campaign achieved what the Allies had hoped, securing a vital foothold that protected critical supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. Henderson Field, once a contested strip of coral and mud, became a linchpin for future operations. From this airfield, American forces launched reconnaissance missions and bombing raids that targeted Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands and beyond. The loss of Guadalcanal denied Japan the opportunity to isolate Australia, effectively securing the continent as a base for Allied offensives. The psychological impact of the campaign was equally significant. For the Japanese, the failure to retake Guadalcanal shattered their aura of invincibility. The Imperial Army and Navy, which had achieved stunning victories in 1941 and early 1942, now faced a harsh reality of a resource-intensive war against an increasingly formidable enemy. Reports from the battlefield described exhausted, malnourished soldiers succumbing not only to enemy fire, but to disease and starvation. The campaign's toll on Japanese morale reverberated through military ranks and civilian leadership alike. For the Allies, Guadalcanal represented their first major land victory against Japan. The campaign demonstrated that the Japanese war machine was not infallible and that, with sufficient coordination and perseverance, it could be defeated. This newfound confidence galvanized American forces and their allies, setting the stage for future offensives in the Pacific. Commanders like Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Alexander Vandegrift emerged as heroes, their leadership lauded for turning the tide of war. Their successes were celebrated not only by military strategists but also by civilians back home, who saw Guadalcanal as proof that victory was possible. The campaign also underscored the importance of international collaboration. Australian coast watchers, who risked their lives to provide intelligence on Japanese movements, played a critical role in the Allies' ability to anticipate and counter enemy attacks. New Zealand contributed troops and logistical support, reinforcing the sense of unity among the Allied nations. This cooperation laid the foundation for an enduring partnership in the Pacific, one that would strengthen as the war progressed. Operationally, the lessons learned on Guadalcanal were invaluable. The Allies refined their understanding of amphibious warfare, identifying weaknesses in their logistical and tactical approaches. Naval forces improved their coordination with ground and air units, recognizing the necessity of integrated strategies in future campaigns. Similarly, the campaign revealed the critical importance of supply chains. The struggle to maintain resources on Guadalcanal highlighted the logistical challenges of war in the Pacific, prompting significant adjustments in how the Allies planned and executed operations. Japan, too, absorbed painful lessons. The overextension of its forces and the inability to adequately support them revealed glaring flaws in its strategic planning. The reliance on night attacks and banzai charges, while effective in certain contexts, proved insufficient against well-entrenched and well-supported Allied defenses. Moreover, the failure to maintain naval and air superiority around Guadalcanal underscored the limitations of Japan's industrial capacity to sustain a prolonged conflict. As the war moved into 1943, Guadalcanal became a stepping stone for the Allied island-hopping campaign. The victories at Tarawa, the Marshall Islands, and eventually the Marianas were all made possible by the momentum gained in the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal also served as a sobering reminder of the cost of war. The death toll on both sides was staggering, with tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors losing their lives. For many, the island became a symbol of sacrifice, a place where ordinary men performed extraordinary acts of courage. The legacy of Guadalcanal endures in the annals of military history. It was a campaign of firsts, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific, the first sustained test of Japanese resolve, and the first demonstration of the Allies' ability to adapt and overcome. It was also a campaign of contrasts, triumph and tragedy, innovation and error, hope and despair. For those who fought there, Guadalcanal was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible that defined the course of the war. Today, the name Guadalcanal evokes memories of heroism and resilience. From the Marines who held the line at Henderson Field to the sailors who fought and died in the waters of Ironbottom Sound, their sacrifices are remembered as a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure and prevail. The campaign's lessons continue to inform military strategy, and its stories inspire generations to reflect on the cost of freedom and the enduring importance of unity in the face of adversity.